Welcome back, everybody. Those who are still coming through the door, can we don't miss this. This is a high point. It's my pleasure to introduce the President of the Australian Medical Students Association, Mr. James Lawler, who will give a presentation. Thank you.
Hi everyone. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land, the Turrbal Aboriginal Nation. I pay respect to their elders, both past and present. I'd like to thank the AMA for having me here today, especially to speak to you for such an extended period about the perspective of medical students and the future of our profession. As Bev said, my name is James Lawler. I'm a medical student from the University of Newcastle. I was born in Maitland, a regional city about 45 minutes from Newcastle. My parents were both nurses, and from a young age, my mother wanted to see me fulfil my potential. Her and my father scrimped and scraped so that myself and two younger sisters get the best education, and I started university as the first person from my family to ever get a tertiary education. Unfortunately, I'd taken the advice of the careers advisor at school, who told me that the mining industry in the Hunter Valley would last forever, and that I'd really enjoy engineering. I did not enjoy engineering. 3 weeks after I'd started, I disappointed my family by quitting, working as a waiter in a restaurant and then leaving to travel the world as so many people in my generation do now to find my soul. I came back with a renewed passion for people. I'd seen remote villages in Ecuador and I'd seen the disparity between the rich and the poor in Africa and decided that I'd love to go back one day with a real skill, with a real profession and help those less fortunate. I was lucky enough to start medicine at the University of Newcastle. Through trying to offset my learning about the nitty-gritty of biochemistry and anatomy with some broader public and global health issues which interested me, I became involved in AMSA. Now, AMSA is an exciting but scary entity. We run the world's largest student-run conference. Some of you may remember our national convention, or not remember it, depending on the week you had. This year there will be over 1,500 delegates in Melbourne. We also have over 700 students in Perth in August for our 11th Global Health Conference. And yet, despite these enormous multi-million-dollar operations, we are 100% volunteer run by medical students who complete their medical school studies concurrently, to whom I'm incredibly grateful. As the president of AMSA, this is all empowering, but also all-consuming and challenges me every day. One of the great aspects of my role, though, is the support I get from the AMA. From the moment I was elected, Brian, Steve and all of the AMA leaders made themselves available to me to provide me with guidance. Anne and all her staff at the AMA give me advice when I require it, and also Fiona Davies and her fantastic team at AMA New South Wales. I'm extremely grateful for all the support I get from the AMA, and on behalf of AMSA, I'd like to say thanks. Earlier this year, I was driving down to Canberra for a couple of meetings with the AMA to meet Brian Auler and Anne Trimmer. And to my shock and horror, I was running late. Believe it or not, as a 100 zone became an 80 zone, I was pulled over by an unmarked police car for speeding. As an officer lectured me, the irony of the situation dawned on me. I, the AMSA president, had just been caught speeding on my way to meet with Brian Auler, the face of road safety in Australia. I kid you not, as I looked up, Brian's face was on a billboard on the hill with the message, "Don't rush." Brian, I'm sorry I was late that day, and I'm sorry I've been late ever since. I'm sure you'll understand. I'm indulging myself in this anecdote because whilst I appreciate the irony and probably the humour, it's actually not that funny. Right? According to the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, road accidents account for about a quarter of all the deaths of young people like myself. And as a supposed leader of youth public health, I decided that I was above the rules of common sense and road safety. I thought it was better than other drivers, and that I could undertake safe speeding. I thought to Brian's well-publicised question, would I rather be late to a meeting with the AMA President and Secretary General, or rush, lose control and kill myself? And I'm raising this today because I want to offer a bit of hubris to begin with, right? I've seen many people in medical student politics, and the ones who go furthest are always able to offer some humility. Those who don't get stuck trying to do everything themselves, make poor decisions. I'll ask the same of you today, because whilst medical training in a new medical school are at the top of my agenda at the moment, Today I have a captive audience of Australia's doctors. As medical students, we don't often have your full attention. When I'm not head of a national institution, I'm just another medical student, joining teams of doctors on their ward rounds. I've had busy doctors who don't remember my name even after several weeks of my presence, but I've also met great doctors who are interested in me and my colleagues and take the time to teach us. As a future doctor, it always amazes me how much teaching can be taken for granted as part of the role of the doctor. It is expected of me as a senior medical student to teach my juniors, and it will continue to be an expectation as an intern, as a registrar and a staff specialist. And yet it is simply assumed that I will somehow inherently know how to teach and how to manage and assess the performance of those who I'm supervising. I hope this can change in the profession as we move into the future. But with a captive audience of Australia's doctors, I'd like to speak to what I think is the biggest issue affecting my peers: bullying, harassment, sexual harassment, and their mental health. I had a journalist ask me at the start of this year, "What do you think of the current environment of bullying in hospitals?" At the time, it wasn't a question I was normally asked. I thought about my own experiences. I'm a white male. I'm able to speak confidently. I have thick skin. I was chatting with some of AMS's past presidents last night, and unfortunately we all seem to fit this carbon copy of the tall, white male leader, which the Honorary Miss Julia Gillard challenged and questioned last night. However, my experience in hospitals is probably fairly unique. It wasn't until a vascular surgeon from Melbourne made the offhand comment that one of her colleagues would have been better off providing a blowjob to her superior in order to progress her career rather than standing up for sexual harassment that I suddenly began to get a flood of reports of sexual harassment in our hospitals. I spoke to a good friend of mine, a female medical student, and asked her what she thought. She told me about one of her previous surgical supervisors. She described him as a young surgeon, a nice guy, and a good teacher. However, whilst walking between wards to see patients once, she dropped her pen and bent down to pick it up. As she bent down, he jovially made the comment, "Oh, well, while you're down there." And this doctor wasn't a serial creep, he was a joker, who just meant to sort of push the boundary to get a laugh. But little did he know of the offence he'd caused. He also seemed to like to make jokes about gay people during his surgeries. And little did he know that the other student under his supervision was gay and stood in silence, wishing he'd stop. Now, my friend is a medical student, but also has a background in law, so speaks more confidently than most of her female colleagues. I asked her, did she raise these issues with her supervisor? Her answer was that of course she didn't. She'd wanted to, but her marks for that rotation rely entirely on the report from that supervisor. So why would she do anything except stay silent and inflate his ego? The issue of bullying, harassment and sexual harassment is an important piece of the puzzle for the mental health of my peers. A Beyond Blue survey from 2 years ago showed that medical students and doctors experienced higher rates of psychological distress and also had higher rates of suicidal thoughts. It showed that the typical at-risk doctor is the female junior doctor, although it couldn't explain the disparity between males and females. Now, the issues for my peers don't only end in offence or in mental illness. All of you would have heard about the tragic suicides of 3 psychiatric registrars and an intern earlier this year. I never knew these people, so I can't tell you their story, but I promise you they had one. They had a story just like mine. They had a proud mother just like mine. And they made mistakes just like mine, and now they are gone, and they are lost to this world because whilst they had hopes, dreams and aspirations just like mine, they could not see a way out of the black hole of medical training and took their own lives. We have wasted some of Australia's best and brightest. Now, like I said, I've had forgettable teachers and I've had great ones. And as such, I don't mean to paint the profession with a broad brushstroke. I've been welcomed here to the AMA and I've found some great mentors, and I'm sure that there are great teachers in this room who are to take the well-being of their juniors very seriously. But as president of AMSA, I'm a big fish in a small pond. Once I graduate and become an intern, I will become a small fish in a big pond. I move to the bottom of a hierarchy which will take me many years to scale, if at all. It can't be my job or the job of my junior peers at the bottom of the food chain to speak up, because the hierarchy is too high and too strong. Now, you may have heard of Lieutenant General David Morrison, who's recently taken leadership on this issue of sexual harassment in the Army, where an even greater hierarchy probably exists, responding to allegations of systemic sexual harassment in the Defence Force. In a YouTube video, which has now gone viral, he looks down the barrel of the camera and he says, "Every one of us is responsible for the culture and reputation of our Army and the environment in which we work. If you become aware of any individual degrading another, then show moral courage and take a stand against it. No one has ever explained to me how the exploitation or degradation of others enhances capability or honours the tradition of the Australian Army. I will be ruthless in ridding the Army of people who cannot live up to its values. And I need every one of you to support me in achieving this. The standard you walk past is the standard you accept. That goes for all of us, but especially those who, by their rank, have a leadership role." End quote. Ladies and gentlemen, as I said, I'm not blaming each and every one of you of bullying or disregarding our mental health, nor am I saying that the AMA or any one college needs to be the sole actor in this space, and recognise that many of the gains that need to be made are in policies and procedures within hospitals who employ doctors in that setting. But I need your help to change the culture in medicine. The standard you walk past is the standard you accept. I cannot tell my peers to take a stand against perpetrators of bullying and harassment because the hierarchy is too often too high and too strong. I need your help, and it needs to come from you. I appreciate that there is work being done in this space to improve the situation for my colleagues. I'm glad the Royal Australasian College of Surgeons has set up an independent expert advisory committee to give recommendations to the college, and I'm appreciative of Brian and the AMA and its swift response in setting up a roundtable on sexual harassment and their work since. I'm well aware the profession has been put on notice by reports in the media, but please forgive my pessimism at the moment. For the day after Four Corners report this week on bullying and sexual harassment, I got reports from medical students at a university, which will remain unnamed, that their head of paediatrics told a lecture room full of students that they were arrogant, stupid, and that students who experience anxiety before exams are weak. We can do better than this. Believe it or not, doctors once upon a time used to prescribe cigarettes for some ailments, and many of them smoked themselves. But I've had many doctors tell me proudly, though, that as the rate of doctors who smoke in Australia declined, the population followed them. That is, it required leadership from the medical profession in order for Australia to get to where it is today, one of the world leaders in tobacco control. I wonder if one day we will be able to tell the same story in regards to mental health, which is arguably the greatest health challenge facing Australia today. When will this profession take its own mental health seriously? I hope one day I see a study that shows that the declining rates of suicide, psychological distress and mental illness in the medical profession was closely followed by a similar decline in the Australian community. And I hope you can help me. Thank you.
Well, one of the most remarkable features about AMA conference is that year after year we have an address from the AMSA president, all of them excellent, and this one outstanding. So thank you, James. It's now my pleasure to introduce the next session, and I'll introduce our chair. Dr. Daniel McMullen is the current chair of the AMA New South Wales Doctors and Training Committee. She's also the Doctors and Training representative on the AMA Council of General Practice and a director of AMA New South Wales. Dr. McMullen is a Sydney-based general practice registrar with experience both in hospital and community medicine since she graduated from the University of New South Wales. Welcome, Danielle. We look forward to your session.
Thanks, Beth. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd firstly also like to thank James for that excellent, poignant talk. Wise words indeed, and I'm certain that the Council of Doctors in Training would echo your thoughts, and that we look forward to working with you and other stakeholders on that important issue. So thank you, James. But to our session this afternoon. My name, is Danielle McMullen. I'm a GP registrar in Sydney, and it's my great pleasure to chair this session today on the future of general practice training. As I'm sure you've all noticed, general practice is a changing landscape. Solo practitioners are becoming few and far between, and we're seeing a rise in group and corporate practices. There have also been significant changes to general practice training. Our speakers today, Professor Simon Wilcock, Dr. Penny Need and Dr. Sally Banfield, will explore this changing face of general practice and discuss how we might best train our next generation of general practitioners to care for all Australians into the future. As the guardians of Australia's health, GPs are often the first point of entry for patients into our healthcare system, and they accept a large proportion of the responsibility for preventative health care, coordination of care, and chronic and comorbid disease burden. But good teamwork is essential to our medical profession. It encourages patient-centred, evidence-based care, and importantly provides personal and professional support for us as doctors to alleviate the burden of isolation and to improve our own well-being. But how should practices be structured? How should new technologies be harnessed to improve communication? And how should the roles and responsibilities of the GP, allied health practitioners and consultant specialists be defined? And again, how do we best train our registrars to work in this ever-changing future? As well as this uncertain but exciting future, as many of you would be aware, along with the GP co-payment, the freeze on rebates and a whole host of other short-sighted healthcare policy in the 2014 federal budget, significant changes were made to the GP training program. These changes were significant in scope and included the abolition of General Practice Education and Training, or GPET, who oversaw selection and administration of the training program, and they also announced a competitive tender process for a smaller number of regional training providers and the termination of the Pre-Vocational General Practice Placements Program, or PGPPP. And this was all in order to fund 300 extra registrar positions, which, while these extra positions are very welcome, how these changes will impact on the future of general practice is uncertain. Questions have been raised about how to maintain the quality of general practice training, how to keep supervisors and teaching practices engaged, as well as how to promote general practice as a career to junior medical officers when scrapping of the PGPPP means that JMOs no longer have a structured pre-vocational experience in the community. There is also concern that ongoing uncertainty about reforms to general practice funding, as we heard in yesterday's session, may also discourage practices from employing registrars. The uncertainty created by these changes, though, gives the profession opportunity to reflect on and influence future models of GP education and training. GPs will continue to have to balance the three arms of preventative care, acute care and chronic disease management within an environment of ever-increasing cost pressures while still providing high-quality, evidence-based, patient-centred care. Today's session will explore the current environment and wide-ranging reforms to general practice training and consider what actions need to be taken to build a sustainable general practice workforce equipped to meet the health needs of all Australians. Each of our panellists today will share their take on their experiences in general practice, where they see the profession heading, and some thoughts around what constitutes a quality general practice training program. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce our first speaker today, Professor Simon Wilcock. Professor Simon Wilcock is a GP who splits his time between clinical practice, research and a multitude of other roles. He's worked in both rural and urban New South Wales, and his educational and research interests include musculoskeletal medicine, the health of doctors and generational change in the medical workforce. Professor Wilcock is the chairman of Avant Mutual Group, a director of the Northern Sydney Medicare Local and AMA New South Wales counsellor. Recent roles include the chair of GPET and independent board member of Health Workforce Australia. So I'm sure you'll agree he's very well qualified to share his insights into GP training for the future. Thank you, Simon.
Thanks very much, Danielle. He's either well qualified or he's the poster boy for midlife crisis, which is probably relevant to this particular course. And I think it is good. I mean, I'm at an age where my career in medicine really, including being a student, has really occurred during the times of the original first Medibank and then Medicare. We're going to talk about general practice training in a moment, which is dear to my heart, but if you can excuse me, I'm just going to digress to pick up on what James talked about first. When I did my PhD nearly a generation ago, the topic of my PhD was the relationship between stress, burnout and performance and psychosocial outcomes in new medical graduates. I've been had a passionate interest in doctors' health, but also specifically issues affecting young doctors for many years, and I love working with young doctors, and that's why it's a privilege to be asked to speak at this DIT forum. I agree with everything James said, except for one thing. The hierarchy does not mean that you have to be quiet. I was in Santiago in Chile just over a week ago, and I went to a museum called the Museum of Memories and Human Rights, which is a reminiscence of the 17 years under Pinochet that they experienced in Chile. And one of the things I hadn't realised, I knew a lot about that period. Some of my friends had been Chilean students at that time. Salvador Allende was a doctor. He was the head of an democratically elected government who, depending on which version you believe, was either assassinated or committed suicide in a coup. What I hadn't realised is that of the thousands of people that were tortured and died in Chile over the next 17 years, doctors were overrepresented. Doctors are leaders and doctors don't have to be victims. If you're in a situation where things are not appropriate, I don't believe for a moment that any one of us doesn't have the rights and the responsibility to speak up. And what I was saying to the group beforehand, I'd really welcome, I've been working in this area a long time, I'd really welcome an opportunity if anybody wants to have a formal chat, and James and your colleagues, about how do we actually turn this around rather than just keep talking about it. I talk to the colleagues, some of those people that are perpetrating those terrible things that people do. They're victims too, and we're perpetrating a culture of victims of victims. These people have been damaged by their own experiences, and rather than blaming them, we, and you guys, my younger colleagues, we can actually turn that around, but we have to speak up. It's not about careers and things like that. It will not damage your careers. In fact, it will show you as true leaders, so let's do that. So on to my real brief. Initially I was asked to give a supervisor's perspective on general practice training, and then that evolved into sort of an overview, which is appropriate given that, general practice is interesting. Some people say these today, it's a career for old men and young women, and I guess we're pretty representative of that up here on the stage. But given that I've been involved with general practice and healthcare during the sort of 40 years or so that it's been talked about and topical in Australia, I think it's useful to give an overview, and it's specifically directed to the young doctors, the students, the doctors in training in the audience, and many of my colleagues are the other reference and resource people who feel free to challenge me later on. I've gone away from the AMA template because it was too hard to populate after that. Is this going to... So there we go. So we're going to talk about the future of general practice. Does it have a future? Do we need postgraduate training for general practice? Because these are all questions that have been asked a lot in the past. And then particularly look at what we've learnt from a 40-year focus on general practice training in Australia. And then finally, current issues and solutions. There's lots of stuff, and I've only got about 10 or 12 minutes now to talk about the justification for a robust primary care sector. I'm going to go back to one of our old favourites. She's not an Australian, the late Barbara Starfield, who was a paediatrician turned health economist. But some of the statements she was making 10 and 15 years ago really still defined and have been upheld by some of the good reports that come out for the Institute of Health and Welfare here in Australia over the last decade or so. And just some very concrete evidence-based stuff. Evidence of health-promoting influence of primary care has been accumulating and shows that primary care helps prevent illness and death, more so than specialist care, and before people rise up in anger, we'll come back to that, and is associated with a more equitable distribution of health in populations. Same people looking, and when they were reviewing the literature, basically this sort of really concrete point. And remember, we're talking about North America here, where they don't have a strong primary care sector, and people self-select to go into specialists without necessarily any sort of primary care filter. And what they reflected is what many of us inherently know, that about 75% of a particular sort of consultation could have been done by the GP, using the consultant as a true consultant for difficult cases, provided that the GP had access to that information. I'm not going to spend any longer on it, but there's lots and lots of accumulating evidence, including in the Australian evidence here now. So the summary is, yes, we need a robust primary care sector. I was at the Asia Pacific WONCA conference, the World Organisation of Primary Care Organisations, a few years ago. Every other country in the Asia Pacific region, from first world to third world, is trying to increase their primary care workforce, because they know, the health economists are our new best friends in primary care, that if you're actually going to develop good economic, equitable and good outcome, cost-effective healthcare, you've got to have a robust primary care sector. And as I said, it's got to articulate with an appropriately accessed specialty system. This is not about saying one group is better than the other, and we desperately need our consultants to act in that capacity. I think we quite serendipitously adopted a healthy model when we adopted Medicare of a referral-based system for specialist care. I'm not sure what wisdom it was done with, but I think it's actually the right sort of model for us to have. Okay, so then the question becomes, do we need postgraduate training for general practice? You know, isn't that the stuff that you get taught in medical school, and, you know, everything else in terms of developing a specialty is really on top of that? I often used to give a talk called "Or Are You Just a GP?" because that was, you know, if you are a GP, you'll recognise that. You know, it's the clause that hangs off of so many questions when you meet people in the community. Do you do this, this, or this, or are you just a GP? Oh, I didn't mean to say that, but it's quite true. Talking about the Four Corners report the other night, and I'm not going to buy into the relative merits of that very complex situation, but the thing that really peed me off, I have to say, is that twice, not once, but twice during that interview, did you pick it up? What's going to happen to this poor young woman? Her career is in tatters. She may just have to be a GP. Twice that came up. I think I was justified. I mean, what it shows us is that we're all bullies and we're all victims and we all operate under stereotypes in time. So rather than sort of blaming and saying good and bad, we all get caught up and trapped sometimes in that sort of labelling and demeaning type language, and certainly there was some of that from senior colleagues in that particular report. The perception of general practice has, you know, gone through the usual sort of sinusoidal curve. William Osler, the great William Osler, responsible for so many wonderful quotes, but he was the sort of classic generalist from the late 19th, earliest century, 20th century, who talked about, you know, the good doctor understands the disease, the great doctor understands his patient. And then what happened through most of the last century was that there was a perception that general practice was a sort of a redundant default option, or generalist practice, that was ultimately going to become extinct. And I'm not really sure what precipitated that. The medical sociologists feel that it probably had something to do with the adoption of a new medical education system, the Flexnerian system in North America, where there was this burgeoning degree of knowledge, so we picked what we could measure, which was organ systems at a microscopic level. We couldn't measure genomes and molecular things, and we sort of split the patient into organ systems, and that became the way we coped with this burgeoning knowledge, and therefore generalism became too hard. But interestingly, in more recent times, there's a lot of people talking about generalist practice being the cornerstone again of a robust healthcare system. And I think the move and the understanding that it's actually all about the patient dummy, it's not about the organs, it's all about the patient and patient-centred care is one of the things that promoted that. But the wonderful digital revolution that has meant that we can all manage and access vast amounts of information at a time appropriate has been a significant advantage. I can do things with a few keystrokes on my desktop in my practice now that used to take me, you know, a week of writing or phoning the college library in Melbourne when I was a rural practitioner, waiting for them to find an article and mail or even fax it up to me. So, I told you I was going to be a little bit controversial and challenging. So what about the last 40 years? Well, up to 1975, really there wasn't any prescribed formal training, and yet when you think about it, there were some fantastic generalist practitioners out there. So does that mean that we really don't need a formal training system? In 1974, a guy called Albert Himmelhock, who was a GP on the North Shore of Sydney, convinced Hornsby Hospital to set up a practice that actually would rotate residents through from out of the hospital into general practice to give them some of those skills. And shortly afterwards, the family medicine program, sponsored by the Royal Australian College of General Practitioners, developed. And that was the first real inkling that there needed to be formal investment in general practice training at that time, and I've been working in that practice or its historical offshoot for the last 25 years. Interestingly, as somebody who went through that program early, what was the family medicine program and then became the RACGP training program, while I really enjoyed it, I always considered I was very lucky doing it in its early phases, because as the longer I was in it, and later as a supervisor and not as a trainee, it became a bit more rigid and less flexible. And I always had concerns about that. General practice is all about being specific to the environment and the patient group that you're working in, and rigidity and flexibility, which was sort of often premised on standards, was not always a neat fit. And around 2000, and I can't remember the exact events, it happened over a couple of years, there was dispute within our generalist ranks, and that in terms of the focus of the training program, and the college lost control of the training program with the establishment of a more bureaucratic model, Canberra-centred, with general practice education and training and the regional training providers. And I spent between about 2005 and 2011 as the chair of GPAT, and it was an interesting experience. I think there were some advantages from having a centralised administrative model. We actually had good input at a board level from the stakeholders, but again we would ask ourselves, taking it away from the people who actually understand and are delivering general practice, is that the right model to do? And of course the two colleges, by that time we had two colleges, they maintained control of standards and assessment. And then of course in last year's budget, along with the other catastrophic things that Peter Dutton announced, he announced the end of GPAT. I must have offended him. I'd met him a few times before the successful Liberal Party, the National Liberal Coalition election a couple of years ago, because at that stage I was on the HWA board, I'd been associated with GPAT, I was on a Medicare local board, and I was head of the Federation of Postgraduate Medical Education Councils. I had a lot of spare time after the May budget last year, I can tell you. And I mean, it was illogical. It was the sort of devastation of a lot of things that related to primary care and good workforce planning, with no clear idea of what was going to take its place. And of course, the big issue is, can we really see the wood for the trees? We have best practice, I think best practice primary care training in the world, and have had for decades. But given that we're going to now have a new trimmed down model with not a lot of increased investment, in fact less investment in it, how can we make sure that we keep the bits that are really valuable? Just going to go very quickly through these few slides, which only go up to 2010, or from my GPET days, which really just illustrate that we've actually been applying a lot of science to that, to this. The blue bars there are the numbers of applications we were getting for general practice training between those years, and the red and green bars, the red bars were the numbers of positions we had to offer, and the green were the actual positions that we did offer. And you can see towards the end we were over offering because we knew there'd always be a bit of dropout. But we actually had a science approach to this, and on that basis we were actually able to lobby successfully the Abbott as health minister, and other governments also subsequently for increased fundings. One of the worrying trends though was that a lot of our increase was not in Australian medical graduates. We still weren't really cutting it in Australian medical schools, and that's a graph that we developed at GPET where we aim to get back to about 35% of Australian graduates going into primary care, which I think is a sort of a minimum healthy sustainable model for a primary care workforce. And I don't know if we've reached that yet, but I suspect not. And just to point out too that our registrar workforce, which are the red part of those graphs, they are a significant contributor to our workforce in all parts of Australia, or all of our areas, between 5 and 12%. I'll leave that one out. So, Finally, to finish on what I think the current issues are, and this is where I'm going to be interested to see what my co-speakers say, but also to get challenged by you guys from the audience. How do we see what's important in terms of maintaining it? The previous systems, as I've said, have, I think, been best in the world, but they have been very expensive. We have to be fiscally responsible, as earlier speakers in other sessions have said, and it was probably a too expensive model. It was also very administratively cumbersome, and you have to ask about what were the reasons for that. A lot of it related to politicisation and having to cover all sorts of political agendas, but also this sort of sense of, we're investing in from money from Canberra, therefore we have to monitor it and order it. But also the colleges themselves, I think, have been guilty in terms of being overly prescriptive in terms of standards and other requirements. Huge inconsistency, and Danielle alluded to that in her introduction, in the training pipeline. I mean, how illogical to develop a pre-vocational general practice program at a time, this was developed at a time where we had increased graduates, we couldn't accommodate them in hospitals. The perfect answer was to train people in the community. How illogical and inconsistent to abandon that. But I would say that even at an undergraduate level, and I'll finish in a minute, Danielle, even at an undergraduate level, there's been a lack of investment. We train too much in hospitals when most healthcare, including specialist healthcare, actually occurs out in the community. And as I've said, there therefore hasn't been the appeal. The numbers argument, we all get anxious about numbers. Ross Kerridge and I were reflecting that it was the same 40 years ago when we graduated, the panic about that there won't be any jobs. The HWA data that we got to put out before, again, we were axed by the current government, there's not a lot of evidence that there's going to be unemployed doctors out there in the future. Yes, you might have to make some career decisions and choices, but the way we practice and our career silos are going to evolve over time anyway. Let's lead that, let's not panic about it. An abysmal failure, I think, by governments of all persuasions to actually look at a sustainable model for primary care, and it's commendable that the College of GPs have put out their discussion paper on, okay, let's, what do we need to build a system of primary care that's sustainable, and I'd invite you all to respond to that. So what are the solutions? Well, I think we need to work out what are the important things, and to me, it's about being patient-centred care and continuity of care. We need more support and consistent support from the Commonwealth, and we actually need more equitable relationships between the primary care sector and the state and territory health departments. I wrote an editorial last month in AusDoc which said that hospital beds are white elephants. They cost huge amounts of money to feed and maintain, and they don't deliver on their return, and we need to turn the public debate away from hospital beds to community-based services. We need to support trainees. We need more flexible curriculums, not more rigid ones, and more flexible training environments. And I think that's the challenges for the organisations that will be tendering. The tender documents came out yesterday for the new regional training providers. And we need to look after our supervisors. And that's the most significant person in my development as a doctor and my career as a primary care practitioner is Keith Wish, who turned 90 earlier this year. But that's the person that will turn you into a really good GP and primary care provider if you support them. Won't say much about that other than that really is just to illustrate that, again, it's not about a bell-shaped curve, it's about working out that we work with a cohort of high-achieving graduates, highly motivated. Most trainees in most disciplines are going to do bloody well however badly we teach them. We really only need a system that focuses on those that are failing to achieve benchmarks. That's basic good educational philosophy, but it often doesn't get applied. So can we do it? And this is a quote from Stephen Leader, who I know is a controversial figure for some of our colleagues at the moment, but he said it back in the time of the 2010 election. It's a very messy system-setting policy, but it needs to be done. So can we do it? Last slide. And I've deliberately chosen Barack Obama there. As Julia Gillard said, he is an inspirational politician. And yes, he has aged, in the years since that photo was first taken. But it's up to us to do it. And then the same comments that I would make about bullying and harassment, don't wait around for other people to change the policies. It's for us to do. And one of the best things I did in my life, in my career, was to actually say, no, I'm not going to do it just because you say that my career will be over if I don't do this or I don't apply for that job. And it's an incredibly liberating experience. I invite you all to get involved with primary care training, but also to work with me on the bullying and harassment agenda. Thank you, Danielle. I'm sorry I went over.
Thank you very much, Simon. Engaging as always. Just a reminder in terms of housekeeping, remembering that the online Q&A system is not functioning at the moment, so we do have microphones set up, so please scribble down your questions as we go, and there'll be plenty of time for questions at the end. So our next speaker is Dr. Penny Neade, who's a practice partner at Pioneer Medical Centre in South Australia. She tutors medical professional and personal development at the University of Adelaide and is a Director of General Practice Training at Southern Adelaide Local Health Network. Dr. Neade has previously worked with Adelaide to Outback, which is a regional training provider, as a medical educator, and she's got ongoing involvement in GP registrar selection. She's a member of the AMA Council of General Practice. And Dr. Neade is passionate about quality general practice in Australia and the maintenance of a comprehensive training and high professional standards program. Thank you, Dr. Neade, for sharing your thoughts today about what makes for quality general practice training here.
Hello everyone. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak about something I'm so passionate about. I was feeling a bit nervous, so my brother-in-law gave me some advice. He said, just tell some lawyer jokes and then you'll be fine. But I might save those for a bit later. So I'm a relatively new fellow of the Royal Australian College of GPs. I fellowed in October 2012. Since my fellowship, I've become a practice partner at my urban general practice in the northeastern suburbs of Adelaide. I love my job and I love my practice. I'm just starting to feel the weight of the responsibility of it all and a little bit of a feeling of being undervalued. Where did these feelings come from? Well, if we just have a look at what's happened to general practice in the last few years, it might be a bit clearer. So we've had the attempted introduction of the Medicare co-payment, the attempted changes to the Level B consult rebates, the abolition of GPAT, General Practice Education and Training, who were overseeing the Australian General Practice Training Program, the abolition of the pre-vocational GP placements program, which allowed junior doctors to gain experience in general practice both rurally and in an urban environment. And there's also uncertainty about the future of general practice training. Tenders were only released yesterday, despite the current training providers not providing training as of the end of this year. It was slightly heartening to hear Susan Lee say that the new providers will be operating by October, but I have concerns about these very tight timelines. We're all aware of the very concerning Medicare rebate freeze for 4 years, and then there's the MBS review, which has been welcomed but with caution. So first of all, I'd like to say well done to the AMA and the profession in general for the work done to assist with the reversal of the co-payment and the Level B rebate cuts. Even with these wins for the profession, the future looks anything but certain for general practice in Australia. I also work for Southern Adelaide Local Health Network in a tertiary teaching hospital. Junior doctors in this hospital are frequently expressing concerns to me about job security. These are dedicated trainees and they're impressed with what a career in general practice can offer them, but the current climate undermines our ability to promote this career to its fullest. If we want quality general practice in Australia, then we need these passionate doctors to be able to embrace what general practice has to offer. The assault on general practice by the current government is somewhat demoralising. It doesn't lead one to feel that the government values quality general practice. So what is quality? There's no uniform definition of quality in general practice. The World Association of Family Doctors defines quality as the best outcomes possible given available resources that are consistent with patient values and preferences. With decreasing resources and increasing complexity, I personally feel that quality Australian general practice is under threat. The RACGP, Presidential Task Force on Healthcare Reform, stated the quality general practice of the future will continue to see its primary purpose as the provision of general practitioner-led, patient-centred, continuing, comprehensive, coordinated, whole-person care to individuals and their families in their communities. This is a very lofty goal. I just wonder if this is actually the reality for our future. The Clinical Review Committee at the tertiary hospital in which I work recently discussed a case of failure to thrive in an infant. This infant had been seen by 6 general practitioners at 2 different surgeries before presentation to hospital. The infant presented at 12 weeks old, having only gained 730 grams above birth weight. At this point, the mother insisted on referral. This was her 6th visit, and she was eventually referred to the emergency department. Just for some information, there's probably some paediatricians in the audience who could say this better than me, but we would ideally like infants at this age to gain at least 150 grams per week. These are some photos of this boy when he presented. And you can see the marked wasting. Oh, the marked wasting of the buttocks and the thigh muscles. Now, this mother had to insist for referral. The baby had been weighed twice in these 6 visits and had never been undressed to be examined despite her concerns about irritability, vomiting and poor feeding. These subsequent images show the same, oh no, that's another one, but these are 10 days later. So some nasogastric feeding. The baby had a colitis and once refed and managed, he's now thriving and 10 months old, so he's done really well. The paediatricians at the hospital where I work said that if he'd presented maybe 2 days later, this might be a coroner's case that we were dealing with. So my concern is that this case is not a solitary one. Issues raised in this case include the obvious lack of comprehensive whole patient care, as discussed in the RACGP statement, and the lack of continuity of care. Increasing pressures are being put on general practitioners. Our current funding model, as discussed yesterday, rewards throughput. It takes time to conduct a thorough assessment of an infant with poor weight gain and to counsel the parents appropriately. And as discussed yesterday, quality is not rewarded financially. Doctors are under pressure to see more patients more efficiently, and patients have come to expect no out-of-pocket costs for healthcare. So we're trying to do a lot more with less, and it's just not really going to work. So what does all of this have to do with GP training? Well, if we want to maintain our professional standards and have our profession respected, then we need to train the future workforce to that standard. Medicine changes quickly, and we can all recognise some upcoming challenges with an ageing population and an increasing burden of chronic disease, obesity, and mental health concerns. We also need to ensure access for patients. This means we'd have to have GPs where they are needed and willing to meet patient needs. Why are pharmacists delivering vaccinations and ambulance officers offering palliative care services? Well, because patient demands were not being met and they sought things elsewhere. So this raises a question, is there actually a shortage of GPs? The backlash regarding the announcement of the new medical school in Western Australia demonstrates that medical students and junior doctors are concerned about their job prospects. We have a supposed tsunami of junior doctors coming, but how many of these are going to become the quality GPs of the future? The abolition of the PDPPP program means that there is no chance for junior doctors in our state at least to experience working in general practice environment until they are in the training program. This also means that doctors pursuing other specialties will have no exposure to the role of their general practice colleagues. Medical, surgical, emergency terms are all mandated in internship. Why not general practice? Why not primary care, the cornerstone of our health service? This exposure would surely improve cross-specialty understanding and communication, whilst also opening up the training pipeline. Medical school exposure to general practice is very different to the experience of a junior doctor whilst actually working. Like any specialty, until you're exposed to general practice, you do not understand the complexity and the challenges. I'm very pleased that alternative models of reviving this are being looked at, and I really hope that that comes to fruition. I think it's vital for the ongoing health of our profession. In 2015 application process, GPET received 2,351 applications for 1,500 spots. That sounds really great. Just because we have a lot of applicants doesn't mean we're going to have a lot of quality GPs in 3 years' time. We need to select the right people for the job, and then we need to train them to a high standard. So GPET introduced some significant changes to general practice selection in 2010 when they introduced the National Assessment Centres. These consist of a written situational judgment test and multiple mini-interviews in a speed dating format. A recent study commissioned by GPET has demonstrated a significant positive correlation between both of these assessments and subsequent end of training performance. So that's a good start. Okay? If we assume that one's performance in examination is a reflection of one's performance in clinical practice, and that the examinations can actually assess what it means to be a quality GP. But even then, we haven't addressed one of the main points of selection, which is retention. We need doctors rurally, and we need them in areas of increased need. In fact, at the moment, rural suitability is not currently part of the national selection process and has been left to the training providers to discuss at the last stages. The 10-year moratorium that's put on some junior doctors is both a blessing and a curse for rural general practice training. It actually gets doctors out into rural areas, but many of these junior doctors are not committing to a career in rural general practice and resent being moved away from family and support networks. Evidence-based, defensible selection processes are required as we move forward with general practice training. Rural retention of registrars needs to be a priority. Personally, it wasn't until I did a rural placement as a registrar that I had an understanding about the breadth of work and lifestyle available to rural general practice. Nowadays, rural GP registrars in general don't have to do a rural placement. So how are the next generation of doctors going to get this experience? It's good that 25% of medical students now spend 1 year in country, so that's excellent, but student experience does not equate to real clinical experience. There are many barriers to rural retention, as we're all well aware of, and as a profession we need to work together to address these. Financial solutions are helpful, but nothing beats giving junior doctors the experience to go rural before they commit to a training program. So my main concern about the future of my beloved profession is standards. We need to ensure that as GPs we do not accept anything less than the general practitioner-led, patient-centred, continuing, comprehensive, coordinated, whole-person care that the RACGP speaks of. To achieve this, we need opportunities for junior doctors to experience real-world general practice. We need evidence-based selection, focusing on getting doctors to where they are needed, and we need training that prepares them to be the best doctors they can to serve Australian communities. We just cannot accept anything less than a quality training program. Our profession needs it and the Australian people need it. Thank you.
Thank you, Penny. And last but certainly not least, Dr. Sally Banfield is passionate about rural medicine and is an Australian College of Rural and Remote, or ACREM, registrar working in Central Australia. She's planning to complete her vocational training in 2016 with advanced skills in remote medicine. Originally from rural Western Australia, Dr. Banfield moved to Central Australia for her internship 6 years ago. While living rurally, she's completed a wide variety of clinical posts and postgraduate studies to assist her in her rural generalist career. Dr. Banfield is currently the Registrar Director on the ACREM Board and Chair of their Registrar Committee. She's also been active within the AMA community and has previously served as AMA Council of Doctors Training Central Australian representative for a number of years. Thank you, Dr. Banfield, for sharing your insights as both a registrar and rural doctor. Thanks, Sally.
Thank you, and it was lovely to hear the speeches today, and hopefully I get to echo a few things but also add a little bit from a rural registrar perspective. I really want to thank the AMA for having this debate at their national conference. It's that important. I'd like to start initially to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which we are meeting. I pay my respect to their elders past and present, and I publicly support recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the Australian Constitution. Now, so I've been told to always start with a croc. You can't be living in the Territory without showing a croc photo in your presentation or the infamous NT News front pages. If you don't know what planking is, find a doctor in training tonight and they'll tell you over wine. The reality is though, I actually live about 1,500 kilometres away from any beaches, but I do live in a really beautiful place called Alice Springs. As Danny said, I'm from rural WA. I loved my university days, especially traversing through the Kimberley. Most of my holidays were paid for by the AMA with Dr. Yes trips, so thank you for that. And then I moved to Central Australia 6 years ago. At the time, a full-year rural internship wasn't available in rural WA. And here I am, still loving the NT and still loving my career choice. So folks, change is upon us. And the next GP training system is just around the corner. It obviously poses challenges, but I believe significant opportunities for our profession. When fighting for what the future will hold, we need to have a collective aim to guide us through this process. In my mind, I keep coming back to the primary goal of being able to provide an appropriately skilled medical workforce for the community. To achieve this, we need to provide a rewarding pathway and an attractive career for our doctors. This time of change can also provide further focus on the drivers to servicing the most disadvantaged within our population, in particular rural and Indigenous people, with the ultimate goal of health equity in Australia. Junior doctors and GP registrars have the experience and need to have the ability to provide feedback in this time of change. The relative uncertainty in this goal is what an appropriately skilled medical workforce will look like in the future. As we've heard over the weekend and from our distinguished speakers today, there is no doubt the face of primary care is changing. The community needs and expectations are shifting, and there is an ever-increasing reliance on subspecialist care. The evidence would also show a greater need for multidisciplinary community teams, but these come with the ongoing challenges of role definition, funding, and debate over task substitution. And with the corporatisation of practices growing and an alliance with health insurance companies occurring, well, I must admit, it's pretty difficult to brand the general practice career at the moment. But as the patient's comorbidities rise, their options for care increase within and beyond Western medicine, and an ability to access, well, all sorts of information so readily. This actually makes life and health very confusing for the patient. Now is definitely the time to increase our capacity and focus on quality primary care. As my experience as a doctor grows, I'm completely convinced that the GP continues to be at the core of this solution. The tangled web of healthcare requires a skilled clinician and a skilled ally in the general practitioner to make sure safe, necessary and timely healthcare is provided for all Australians. Now, as a rural generalist registrar, I also strongly believe the whole profession needs to play a greater role in solving the maldistribution of our own doctors. The evidence is overwhelming about the positive retention factors. Doctors having a rural background, doctors having a positive rural extended medical experience, and doctors having supported opportunities to train. And yet, a supported, vertically integrated rural pathway is only available in minimal locations. There are some very successful models occurring in rural training, and we can discuss them later, but we need to build on this and actually create a national pathway. The rural doctors also need to be appropriately skilled to meet the challenges of their practice, with opportunities for pre-vocational and vocational advanced skills needing to be guaranteed for these doctors. With my home, the NT, still looking at an average retention rate of about 40% after 2 years of service, we have a long way to go in some areas. We can discuss carrots and sticks for sure, and they matter. With relocation allowance, the HECS reimbursement scheme and GP RIBs, all essential in supporting rural doctors, including myself, during their training. The sticks of bonded medical placements and the 10-year moratorium have not really been proven in the long-term sustainable health workforce solution. But providing doctors with opportunities to gain skills, having appropriate selection of candidates to the rural training pipeline, which Penny actually talked very well about, and having a valuable supported job at the end are really key in solving this issue. It was nice to hear the ministers talk a bit about this language, but we really need to master the right doctors with the right skills in the right place, and that's where the funds should go to. So, based on the varying needs of the community across Australia, how do we provide a national program for registrars that can encompass the broad learning requirements that is general practice? And at the same time, how do we assist with levers for change to improve the maldistribution of our GPs? There are core principles to our apprenticeship model in training that we need to focus on to ensure high standards are maintained through this transition. These include clinical exposure, education and training, supervision and mentorship. I think one more. Firstly, GP registrars encounter undifferentiated patients and sole decision making very early on in their careers. We rely heavily on a broad pre-vocational training experience, followed by a well-structured and supportive vocational training program. Clinical exposure is becoming increasingly competitive throughout this pathway. With the recent government announcements about a version of PGPPP returning and an internship review currently transpiring, now is the time to ensure that community or general practice is mandated to all junior doctors. With increasing trainees, the growth in general practice training cannot be at the detriment of quality placements. We need to continue to make sure in the new model that the colleges have high accreditation standards of the RTPs and their placements. If choosing rural, we then need to work with all sectors of the health system and government to ensure firstly exposure to advanced skills and then attractive generalist careers available at the end. With the changing needs of rural Australians, this training is beyond the stereotypical procedural skills of anaesthetics and obstetrics. While they're definitely still needed, they now include things such as mental health, Indigenous health, palliative care and chronic disease management. Both supervision and education capacity is being stretched. The regional training provider tender applications did open yesterday, and I encourage you to have a read. They don't look too different, to be honest, but the highlights for me do include a definition of the 2 college endpoints. It does provide the opportunity for college involvement in education, and it does encourage, to what degree, RTPs to work collaboratively. In practice, the program will need to be more innovative in their approach to training and supervision to deal with the increased numbers. We will need to maintain standards, and we need to do that to provide more practice and supervisor support. And lastly, they need to share between the training providers so that duplication and mistakes don't recur. We actually have 2 excellent colleges, ACRM and RACGP, to guide us in education and training. With a variety of career endpoints, the curriculum should be the core in providing registrars with the generalist training that we need as a solid base of our career. Generalism needs to remain embedded in our learning objectives and provide guidance to the delivery of our training program on the ground. Generalism is the key to sustainability of our health system. The degree to which a doctor practices generalism in their career, on the other hand, depends on many factors, such as community need, the resources available, the support and infrastructure implemented. But it should not change our training base. The current delivery of training has become complex, with the delineation of training responsibilities between government, colleges, regional training providers and the individual very difficult to navigate. Often registrars are completing requirements for both the college and the training provider simultaneously in the guise of contextualised regional educational syllabus. And they're becoming frustrated. They're frustrated in the inflexibility that provides. In the new training system of now 11 RTPs with even larger boundaries and thus a wider spectrum of contextualised regions, I ask, is it really necessary to go beyond college requirements? GP registrars make active choices, just like in any other specialty, to gain the skills and exposure they want based on the career aspirations they have. The new RTP tender document now states that the provider will consider the delivery of college-led, I think it might be college approved, but anyway, college approved contextualised regional educational syllabus. I now say it will be up to the colleges and the GP Training Advisory Committee to make sure their involvement in this educational and training space provides greater clarity and greater flexibility for their trainees, with a stronger link to our fellowship requirements and a stronger link to our colleagues. Mentorship has always been fundamental to our apprenticeship model. For the average GP registrar, as we discussed today, systems, policies and levers for change. And while they mean a great deal for the cohort, for the actual individual, it is often the supervisor or the colleague who provided mentorship, career advice or embodied their ideal practice that drives us to excellence in our own field. Mentorship provides leaders in primary care and ambassadors for the changing profession, whatever that may be in the future. It also allows the individual to explore and hopefully marry community and individual goals in their career. The system needs to encourage a natural mentorship and peer support program, and it must be available for medical students to retired fellows. Lastly, and a few of us have touched on it today, we need to continue to work on the value and attractiveness of general practice within the profession. Too long have we relied on the overflow effect to provide us with our trainee cohort. With increasing numbers applying, we need to ensure that we are selecting the most appropriate and the most passionate general practitioners that will meet the community needs across Australia. Once in, we need to have supported pathways, flexibility of service and opportunities to have professional development to maintain this high standard of care. If selection occurs appropriately, we should be able to tailor the support and placement opportunities based on individual endpoint and not on government quotas. I love being a rural generalist. I just actually wish there was more of us. These GP training changes are an opportunity for development of our profession and to solve our issue of maldistribution. Ultimately, registrars need a training system that challenges them, supports them, and mentors them to meet the requirements for safe, independent practice. The AMA has to involve future general practitioners in this conversation. Collectively, we have a very good vision and a definite passion to meet the needs of our community moving forward. Thanks.
Thank you, Sally, and thank you to all of you for sharing your thoughts with us today. I do appreciate you being so frank and sharing both your personal anecdotes and visions for the future. So people can feel free to line up for questions, and there's a microphone standing in the middle there, and while people are kind of gathering their thoughts, I just wondered, particularly Simon and Penny, if either of you had any reflections, only because you just spoke, so I thought I'd give you a break for a minute, any reflections following the other speakers?
Look, I guess I would only reiterate what I said when I was talking about bullying and harassment. I love doctors. I think they're a great group of people to work with because they're intelligent, they're articulate, and they're altruistic. They actually operate generally in the interests of communities rather than themselves. Be brave as well. If you don't think the training system or the system that you're working in is the appropriate one, say something about it. Find peers that will support you. It's always hard to stand up against things that you're not comfortable with, but you will always find people who support you. One of my biggest concerns, and as I said, I've worked for so many years in the whole issue of doctors' health and the psychology of what makes us doctors think, and I still like us, so that's good news, is that we do tend to catastrophise and we do tend to say, this is bad and we can't change it. We can. We are, Julia Gillard talked about leadership last night. I think doctors make wonderful leaders because of those characteristics of altruism and not reflecting self-interest. So, participate. Don't be a victim. Victimhood is the flip side of being a bully. Bullies and victims are often the same people, and the psychologists and psychiatrists in the groups can support that. Being a victim is not the way to fix things, whether it's bullying and harassment in your workplace or in a training program. Being a solutions-focused leader is the way to go. And everything that gets you into medical school and through medical training means you have the capacity to do that. So that would be my comment.
And I'd just like to say it was lovely how Sally looked at the positives rather than the negatives. So I could list off all the doom and gloom, but at the end of the day, this is actually an opportunity to make things better. There have been lots of things that we've whinged about for the last 10 years with the training providers. Let's fix some of those things and improve training for the future, for our future workforce.
I guess the other point I would make, and I think Julia Gillard again alluded to it, we live in a media cycle at the moment where what gets publicity is what she calls schlock and horror. And we have to be better than that. We have to actually not tie into not be caught up in the schlock and horror. We have to be objective, we have to be honest in the way that we lead. That's what our communities will appreciate.
Richard.
Hi, Richard Kidd, I'm a GP. I welcome mid students and GP registrars into my practice. I have to take a little bit of issue about the training prospects for a whole lot of young doctors that are coming online in a pipeline that is blocked. You put up some slides that showed that over the last several years, really, the general practice training program has been oversubscribed. And in the next 2 or 3 years, we're going to see significant numbers of second and third year doctors being unemployed, not being able to get into training programs and being pushed sideways by the interns still coming through. So you may disagree with me, and I'd be interested to see if you do, but what options are there to in any way increase capacity for training GPs at this stage? Because we definitely need a lot more GPs.
Yeah, and they're both really good questions, and I'll unpack them. To answer the second one first, we actually have to have some clear workforce goals, and that's what we tried to do in my time at GPED, and then I think HWA picked that up. The traditional model that many people will have been told and will still speak to is, 50% of you will be GPs and 50% of you will be specialists. In fact, when you look at the workforce data, it's more likely a 40-40-20 split. 20% of our colleagues actually don't do clinical work, they do research or journalism and a whole range of other things like that. So we have to think, if we want a robust primary care system, we actually need to think about 40% of our graduates going into primary care. And in terms of entry numbers to general practice, that's what we were doing when I was involved in that. We do have extra places, but the tragedy is that they've been created at the loss of all of those pre-vocational places and the disruption of the pipeline. So absolutely, we have to present logical arguments to government. I have to say, when we did that, government often responds. You have to get through all of the argy-bargy of political agendas. The first part of the question, which is I think the thing that makes us more anxious, is that I think you said there will be. Now, we've been saying that. Ross Kerridge and I were reflecting when we graduated 40 years ago that there were the same discussions, and Ross was talking about his yearbook entry where he talked about the era of uncertainty that we are graduating into because of increased graduates and things like that. The evidence doesn't actually back that up. Now, not all of us will be able to get into the training programs we nominate. Sorry, that's life. But we need to make sure that our workforce is being channeled to where we want it. College of Physicians is uncapped, and I'm currently supervising a PhD candidate who's running a resilience workshop intervention for physician trainees. And one of the things I've learnt from working with physician trainees is many of them are great. Many of them are lost, sad, they don't know why they're there, they don't really have any career. I joke that I think many of them have been told they're too good to be GPs, so they've gone into physician training. And we actually, again, have to be sensible and have those sorts of discussions. The things that we're still grappling with are full-time equivalent workforce. Yes, we're going to have a lot more doctors in the community, but we know in terms of sustainability of careers and staying happy and healthy, most of us may not be full-time equivalent clinicians for the bulk of our career. So they're both great questions, and absolutely we should fight to make sure that there are good answers to them, but we shouldn't be captured by the this is going to happen if the evidence doesn't support that.
Brad Franken from AMA New South Wales. I'm sorry I'm a physician, but I'll ask a question anyway.
Physicians are great.
And I've been involved in medical education for a long while, and I'm very disturbed about the federal government's proposed fee institution for undergraduate medical place. Well, all places, but medical courses will be the most expensive. And whether that is going to be another deterrent for people going into medicine, they'll graduate with very large bank loans or government loans to pay back. There's a freeze on Medicare rebates. They're not going to want to go into general practice. They're certainly not going to want to work at Campbelltown where I work or Alice Springs necessarily if they've got these huge debts. Should we be more vocal about opposing this other proposal from the federal government, because it seems the Vice-Chancellors are certainly not going to oppose it?
No. I'd ask my younger colleagues to comment, but just very quickly. We have to be careful that we're not seen to be self-interested in this particular response. And again, if we stand back and take a community perspective, what's the value of a medical degree and what's the appropriate value? The problem is, and what we've talked about today, and not just in this forum, is most of the government decisions around health are short-term political decisions that are being made, and they're not actually coming from the Department of Health, who in Canberra is full of really good people. There are a lot of good people who understand what their population needs in the Department of Health in Canberra. All of those decisions are coming from Finance and Prime Minister and Cabinet, and they're mostly politically led decisions, like all of those disastrous announcements in the May budget regarding health last year. So again, I think our political industrial organisations have to be vocal, but we have to go back with the evidence and talk about exactly what you're talking about. We know from the North American experience that if we have graduates graduating with huge debt, that's going to affect their subsequent career choices.
There's no doubt there's also some, it's about you providing value. So one is showing exposure to general practice, and I suppose in my rural hat, obviously rural practice, and showing that that can create value in the service. But if you look at sort of probably the more famous Queensland Rural Generalism program, definitely they highlight that one of the other attractive part of it is that they got the government on board, and Health Workforce Queensland pushed very hard to actually create an attractive career at the end that's well rewarded and well supported. So there's no doubt that you have to create value, and part of that is actually the career endpoint.
Hi, I'm Tony Ryan. I'm a general physician as well, and from WA. I've just done a locum in Broome, so it works really well, the service up there. The UWA and Notre Dame have combined to they do common exams at the end of the year, which is a pretty impressive effort from two different medical schools. But when I came back from England 20 years ago, the college GP's president told the college physician president that they encouraged people to do lots of jobs in hospitals before they became GPs, which used to be the English system. I don't know if that's still the UK system. And I think both, I agree with Penny that you should do GP terms. It's a shame about the PGPP, but I think the opposite is also true, because about 50% of the phone calls I got last week were something, if they'd done 3 months med-regging, they would be able to answer it in their sleep. So I think we should be encouraging people to take up service jobs, because I totally agree there's all these physician trainees, as you know, ridiculous numbers of them, who don't know what they want to do. They just think, for some reason, they think physician training is an easy way out, and they just bumble along. A lot of them fail. You know, a lot of the ones who fail do end up becoming GPs. Whether that's good or bad, I don't know. But I think I just want your opinion on whether we should mandate. I know you can't mandate all subspecialties, but if you do 3 months as a service reg, you're going to be a much better GP if you've done a good general medical term, because there's lots of service jobs now.
Do you want to respond?
You can go.
For the RACGP, you need to do, I think it's 10 weeks of a general medical term, but that can be as an intern, where you're a bit of a paper lucky.
No, you do have to do PG, you have to do a full hospital year. So your first year of general practice training is hospital based.
Yeah, but of that, it only needs to be 10 weeks. So that
it
is
has
all
to be PGY too.
Sorry, no it doesn't. So that's all that's mandated at the moment. And then they do have to do another full year in the hospital as an RMO, but so long as they've done during internship an emergency term, a medical term and a surgical term, which they have to do as part of their requirements, they don't have to do any of those terms later on when they're having more responsibility. And at the moment, not GPAT, but you can apply for general practice training as an intern. Very junior. They don't even have referees because they're making their applications in early May. So they're very junior doctors applying for general practice training, and there's a good argument there, I think, to maybe delay that application a little bit longer. But you can have the other argument the other way as well.
It's an excellent point, and it goes back to the issue of flexibility. The AMC, remember, a couple of years ago conducted a review of mandatory terms in internship, and it was a complete schmozzle. For all the effort that went into it, and people like me were on that panel, all we came back was maintain the status quo. And this is where, you know, you junior doctors and medical students are part of the problem too, because you all said, oh no, we want to do an ED term and a surgical term and a medicine term, without actually understanding that there's no evidence that those things actually produce the sorts of career experience you're going to have. There's virtually no such thing as a general surgical term. We would be far better to do what I think you're implying and saying, what are the skills that somebody going into vocational training should have while they're in the hospital system? Okay, which environments can they get those skills in? And the curriculum framework for junior doctors attempts to do that to some degree, even though it lacks some detail, rather than saying it has to be this term or that term. Because I agree with you completely. You know, as somebody who did a lot of procedural terms and things like surgery and anaesthetics when I was a junior doctor, best experiences I ever had as a rural GP. And I think you're quite right about medical reg type terms as well. But we've created some of those problems ourselves where we keep having reviews and we don't change anything.
There's also an issue with hospital jobs though as well. So it can be quite challenging for GP registrars to get the jobs that they need to become the best GPs at the end of the day, especially terms such as paediatrics, everyone's well aware of. And at the hospital where I work, the med-reg jobs are for med-reg. Yeah.
My name's John Zorbas. I'm a doctor in training from WA, and my background's emergency intensive care. Anytime there's a discussion about generalist exposure in pre-vocational care, you tend to have a room full of people who aren't general practitioners, and they stand around and they go, if only there was some kind of area that was, you know, perhaps a practice that was general, where people could get a pretty broad experience in medicine. And people scratch their heads and then they move on to talk about streaming and 2 years this and that. And if you're quiet enough, you can hear the heads of GPs all over the country just exploding silently. I'm extremely proud to come from a state where the AMA-WA, WAGPET and the Acting Director General of Health at the time preserved PGPP in the form of the Community Residency Program, and I think the silence from Peter Dutton when we called for modifications to the A1 rebate from the federal AMA was deafening, and it was a huge loss to the system. As Metro, Rural, Senior, Junior GPs up in the panel, can you please give us your perspective on how we should be changing pre-vocational training so that people actually do get exposure? I don't think applicants to a college or a number of people sitting in exam is a good marker of GPs at the end, as you guys have mentioned today. I would like to know what measures you would see as useful in pre-vocational training, not just to get people interested in general practice, but to also identify those who think, well, actually, I thought I wanted to do GP, but it's not for me, and I want to move on to the field that is actually right for me in the workforce.
I can go. So, I mean, probably we'll take your question and diverge it a little bit. But that's where I'm really passionate about creating vertically integrated rural pathways, and I think we need to be realistic that the reality of a pre-vocational space is that it's getting squeezed from medical school to vocation, and people are creating their own pathways within that. And you're right, in other specialties they have streaming, they have an ability for people to access the appropriate terms based on what their career aspirations were. And that's not so much when you pick a generalist approach. It's very difficult to define what a generalism really is, and I was interested when the intern review is happening at the moment, they're really struggling to define what generalism or the concept of generalism is. But I think at the end of the day, I think, we need to pick what the community needs, and we need mentorship along that process so that people can get the generalist exposure that they want. It doesn't mean you don't do subspecialties, but it means if you actually are part of a pathway, then you'll get mentored along it so that you can either have access to subspecialists like paediatrics, for us as ACRM trainees, obviously anaesthetics, obstetrics, that sort of thing, but also that you actually get that mentorship that actually says, well, how do you put that in context to your career and your aspirations?
The curriculum framework for junior doctors was an attempt to address that outside of that traditional this term, saying to you as a junior doctor, well, actually, these are the sorts of skills we feel that you should experience in your first 2 postgraduate years. There's always a debate about should we allow early streaming or not, and there's not a right answer for, because some people it's important, that's what they want to do, they know exactly what they want to do, and to make them mark time doing something else is a waste of their time, but there are equally others who actually will benefit from that. So we've got to build a system that doesn't disadvantage either group. The AMC review completely wimped out by not really changing the system at all. We said to them, you've got to put in there that some community-based experience. It doesn't have to be general practice, but given that most healthcare is delivered outside of hospitals, you've actually got to, in the first 2 postgraduate years, say to people, you've got to spend at least 1 term outside of a hospital. All they came up with is, it's a really good thing is, but they didn't mandate it, they just stuck with the usual surgery. I loved my surgical terms, but we know that most of the surgical terms are subspecialty terms where often the interns, if they're not interested in surgery, don't go to theatres, they just act as sort of med interns on the ward there. So it was a missed opportunity. But again, a lot of it was trying to keep everybody happy, and I think the AMC wasn't brave enough by actually saying, well, philosophically, I know you think you want this, but there's not evidence for that system.
Back to what you mentioned at the end of your talk too, Simon, about the cooperation between the hospital and the community sector.
Yeah.
And both for trainees who plan a hospital career and those of us in a general practice career, at the moment it's very hard to swap in and out. So if you get partway through your general practice training and you realise you need some extra skills that would be best gained in a hospital, that's very hard to arrange a short-term stint back in the hospital.
The joys of federalism and differential funding for hospital versus community. Virtually any argument you have in health, the end point is if only we just abandoned the states and just had one system, it would make life easier.
Thank you, panel. Jeff Heiss, Metropolitan General Practice in Sydney. I'm an occasional provider of registrar positions in general practice, and we love it, but we can't afford it. And I'm not aware of any other college where mentors and trainers are personally responsible for the income of their residents and registrars. Now, we're at the bottom of the income chain, and for us to be worried about are we actually able to afford a registrar, I think is a major bottleneck in terms of registrar training, and I just seek the panel's direction on how we can either attract some funding, some topping up arrangements, because we love doing it, but we can't afford it.
Yeah.
And the evidence does show that city general practice does a lot less teaching of registrars than rural general practices, so the percentage is quite different, and I think that comes back to workforce need. So often the country needs to take a registrar for that workforce, whereas you may be able to employ an associate who will earn you more money. So there's a financial disincentive to be involved in teaching, and that would be something that I would love could be corrected, but I don't know the reality of the new system.
I think there are two components to it, Jeff, and one of it is a lot of the illogical decisions that have been made around funding and those sorts of things. And we have to lobby to change that, and that's why we're at conferences like this. Those sorts of changes are glacial, and as I've said before, if you hold your breath waiting for change, you go very blue. I think we have to challenge our colleges and the administrative groups that are responsible for training to go back to a leaner model that actually is less administratively cumbersome for the supervisors as well. I've been a supervisor for 35 years myself, and it can be done. So it's not the college's fault, but they're partly responsible for the bureaucracy, and that's something that we could internally change at the same time as we're lobbying for a better system.
I remember my old supervisor said that he gets more money, he'd prefer to take a medical student than a GP registrar. That was the sums. And it's totally true, and even in rural areas. There's no doubt that the health department has actively said that they need to find new models, and there's some scary new models to think about, and that's definitely the next debate and the next conversation the Council of Doctors in Training needs to have about how to support the supervisors. Otherwise we're going to lose them.
There's some good articles published, I think at MJA, coming out of South Australia about 7, 8, 9 years ago around the costs of training and looking at exactly those issues, the cost of training and supervising it at the different levels of the pipeline.
I think general practitioners have that problem across the board, though. It's not just in training registrars, it's also in attending on Friday. All the GPs in the room would have lost their income for that day, whereas maybe some of our specialist colleagues might have a different system with their practice. So the fact is it's the fee-for-service model that comes into play again in this domain.
Suzanne Royal, I'm a paediatrician in Brisbane, and although on the one hand it was disappointing to hear James's anecdote about the paediatrician who was so scathing of the medical students before him, it highlights, I think, the fact that it's not just the College of Surgeons that has problems with bullying in its ranks. And the paediatricians are normally seen as the fluffy bunnies of medicine, but we aren't always. I think it's all very well to say that we shouldn't be victims if we find ourselves in a situation where we're bullied, but I think it's difficult sometimes for someone who finds himself in that situation to recognise that it's happening. And if we as supervisors and mentors ourselves see that somebody is being bullied, it's our responsibility to advocate for them rather than to walk on by. And I think that it's important to reach out to the person who is being treated badly. And my question for anyone on the panel was that within the more traditional college model, we've seen that supervisors are very often the people who are are dually both responsible for the trainee's progression at the same time as being perhaps responsible for the mistreatment. And with the current state of play within general practice training, does the panel have any comments on that, specifically for general practice? And if you have any further ideas for the rest of us and other colleges, we'd welcome that as well. Thank you.
Just before we go to responses, I just ask that in the interest, because we've got to have a motion to pass as well, so the questions from those standing we'll take and try and keep it brief if we can.
there's a whole literature on what effective supervision should be, and there's some really good resources out there, the super guides and things that some of the postgraduate medical councils have developed and some of the colleges themselves, and they tackle those specific issues about, how do you cope with your multiple hats, that you're the mentor but you're also the assessor, and how do you deal with effectively giving feedback versus bullying. So there are resources out there, and again, HWA was actually investing a lot in that, not just for the health workforce, but for not just for medicine, but for the other workforces. But of course, that stuff's all gone.
Sadly, of course, the bullies don't tend to read those.
That's true. I mean, I think from a GP registrar perspective, especially being isolated as I am in Alice Springs, I think the other thing is make sure that the system still has an ability for people to have shared commonality, mentorship and support programs. And I think that's one of the easiest things for the health department to cut. It does cost quite a lot of money to get people together, to get GP registrars in the same room, whether that's a workshop or whether that's just actually purely about peer support. And we are very isolated early on in our careers, and that can make us very vulnerable.
Senior clinicians are often equally isolated, and I would go back to my point, you're absolutely right. Each of us has a responsibility to break that cycle of bad behaviour, harassment and bullying at whatever stage of our career. And it has to be our own personal responsibility, because most of the people who are bullying us are victims themselves. Well, all of them are victims themselves.
I think general practice training does have a protection in the system, though, in that there are the regional training providers, and they are people that the registrars can turn to if they feel that their direct supervisor is a bully, and that has happened at regional training providers quite a bit in the past, and then they can advocate on behalf. And I don't know if other programs have that same system. And that's a key thing.
Ian Fraser, I'm from the College of Physicians, the State Chair in Victoria, and just talk about our contribution, because everything one college does affects another college and so on. And I was just looking at 2011 numbers of the 15,000 people in vocational training, 5,000 were in College of Physicians and about 3,000 were GP training. And our there's a contribution of the medical course in general. You've highlighted that there needs to be some GP training, because if they don't get out from a hospital, they only see a hospital as their career path. But also we haven't really looked at the numbers we need in our college, and we're just doing so now. Until now, that we took on anyone that was working in a hospital and could sit the exams, and we've created the problem. And so the college has a working party now looking at the numbers going into training, and I think we're all quite confident there's going to be a cap on that. So there will be people now having to not just go into the hospital system and drift into being a physician, are going to have to very early on say, what do I really want to do? And I think this will be something that you'll need to follow, and I think it will help you in having people look and be more active in their career choice.
And you're probably aware, Ian, that HWA had actually started doing some of that workforce modelling for different disciplines, and those documents, even though HWA has disappeared, I think the Department of Health still has them.
Steve Wilson, I'm Chair of Council General Practice, AMAWA, and on the Federal Council. Firstly, I'd just like to endorse what you said earlier on, Simon, about the fact that we really need to find out what will be the FTE at the end of the pipeline. This is absolutely critical, because whereas 30 years ago, if you went into general practice and there was 500 of you, that may have equated to 460 FTE. That is not the case now, even if we end up with 1,400, for example, per annum. If you'll indulge me, there's no long queue behind me, so I'm just going to ask all of the...
There's a motion behind you.
Sorry? Yeah, not at all. No motions. No, not at all. Hands up, all the GPs in the room, please. Right. Leave your hand up if you never worked in a hospital. Never worked in a hospital. Right. Hands up at all the non-GP specialists or training to be a non-GP specialist in the room. Leave your hand up if you spend more than 3 months in general practice before you finish your training. Okay, I rest my case. A minority of people actually have any experience of general practice before they finish as a non-GP specialist. We have to change that, because it will create a culture which respects general practice, has an understanding of what community medicine is like. And I think that needs to change.
Can I also say that I think we need to tip the paradigm on its side and not get too hung up about our professional silos. To me, it's all about critical care, chronic, subacute care, chronic and community care, and we all need experience in each of those domains to be effective clinicians.
I'd like to thank you for indulging me for that. My main point is that throughout all of this discussion, there's an elephant in the room which has not been raised, and that is the lack of non-clinical training that GPs receive as part of their training program that will foster the future of general practice. General practice has to own its own future. If you talk to GPs in private, they'll all tell you that general practice is finished as it is. I actually don't share that view, but I really do think that there's a lot of work to do. And that is that there are so many people now who do not want to own their own practices, have got no IT skilling and no business skilling. And in my area, in North East Metro Perth, out of 38 people in our training sector at the end of 2013, of the 38 of them, only 4 were males, the rest were females, and only one of those 4 males said he ever intended to want to own his own practice. The future is bleak from an ownership viewpoint. You will not see specialists in private practice surrendering that level of autonomy in terms of their future direction. So I call upon the colleges and the AMA and all bodies to work together to ensure that we foster the survival of general practice and skilled doctors in not just their clinical skills, but in all the non-clinical skills they will need in order to make sure that general practice survives. Thank you.
While Danielle's getting out her motion there, those of you in general practice who've got as much grey hair as me will remember some articles that came out about 15 or 20 years ago and were published in the sort of mainstream media that sort of said, 70 or 80% of GPs said they wouldn't they'd tell their children not to do general practice or whatever. If you actually read the rest of those articles, most of those GPs said they loved doing general practice. So they weren't anti-general practice, they were just saying it's a really hard environment to work in and we're not being supported. And I think that represents some of the complexities there. I believe that there will always be primary care and general practice because it's such a great area to be in, but we need to assist people to avoid the burnout. I mean, that study was really all about burnout.
Thank you. And can I thank you all for stimulating such good discussion here today and for all of your questions. So now from this discussion today, we've drafted a motion to ensure that the important discussion we've had today about GP training and the future of the GP workforce doesn't disappear over the course of the next year. So it should be up on your screen now, and this motion will be moved by Dr. Danica Thiente, who's our Chair of Council and Doctors in Training Committee, and seconded by Dr. Brian Morton, who is the Chair of our Council of General Practice. The motion, as it reads, is that National Conference notes the challenges and opportunities facing general practice and the changes occurring in the general practice training environment. National Conference calls on Federal Council to generate a vision statement for the future of general practice training that acknowledges the value of general practice, advocates for strong professional oversight of general practice training through a sustainable, high-quality, college-led training program, and guides AMA advocacy on and ensures the sustainability of general practice. So, Danica, would you like to speak to this motion?
I'll speak very briefly, noting the time. As you've heard today, there are significant pressures not only on GP training and our GP trainees, but also on our GP colleagues. We need to acknowledge the challenges and uncertainty facing general practice and support our GP members. We also need to demonstrate the value to our non-members. This vision statement will, of course be important to have a wide consultative process into this to ensure we come up with a really strong vision to take GP, general practice and general practice training into the future. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Dr. Morton, would you like to speak at this time?
I was going to reserve, but I couldn't resist. I'm obviously white, I'm Caucasian, and I'm actually from the North Shore of Sydney. So the absolute choice in my time of being a medical student. However, in hospital, surgery was a real problem because the operating table was always at the wrong height. So I enrolled in the physician training program, and I found that it wasn't a really good fit for my personality, my interests, and as it turned out, I think my skills. So I was fortunate to be enrolled in the FMP Family Medicine program as a trainee in 1975. I don't think it was that long ago. But then, as Simon pointed out, the history is the two colleges fought and the government took away training control from the colleges and GPET was instituted. GPET was a good organisation, an independent organisation overseeing general practice training. Then we've had with this current government the abolition of GPET and the return of control to the Department of Health. AMA supports very strongly college-led training as it does for every specialty. But there are now multiple players in the training arena. 2 colleges, the government, Supervisors Association, Registrars Association, and 11 regional training providers. AMA needs to be in the space. It needs to be able to give some direction as an independent voice with no conflict of interest, supporting general practice training. I commend the motion to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. So obviously in the interests of time, does anyone have any urgent need, strong need to speak for or against the motion, or can we take it to a vote? Good, I don't see any hands, which is great. So on that, that's what it took days of effort, that's for sure. So with that then, on behalf of Dr. Thiempt, then I'd like to move the motion as written there. So all those in favour? And all those, any against? Any abstentions? Thank you. I declare the motion carried. Thank you again for all your involvement.
All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Danny. Thank you, Simon, Penny and Sally. That was an excellent afternoon session. Where's James? James, I was probably later than you anyway, but I just wanted to say that that was a fantastic talk. It was very passionate, and we're very proud as the AMA to support AMSA, the work that you're doing as President and the work of your team. So well done. Now, just when you thought it was safe to go back into the water, another award. And this one is a very important and prestigious and far-reaching award. It is the President's Award. The President's Award goes to a person, not necessarily a medical practitioner, who, in the opinion of the President, has made an outstanding contribution towards furthering the objectives of the AMA. The objectives of the AMA, amongst other things, are to promote the well-being of patients and take an active part in the promotion of healthcare programs for the benefit of the community and to participate in the resolution of major social and community health issues. The winner of the 2015 AMA President's Award is Dr. Catherine Hamlin. Dr. Hamlin and her husband, Dr. Reg Hamlin, co-founded the Addis Ababa Fistula Hospital in Ethiopia. The hospital provides free obstetric fistula repair surgery for poor women experiencing childbirth injuries. For over 50 years, Dr. Catherine Hamlin has made an immeasurable impact on the health and well-being of women in Ethiopia, from the prevention and treatment of obstetric fistulas to training midwives in a very poor, underserved area of the world. Just as importantly, she has ensured that the women she serves are treated with compassion, dignity and respect. Now in her 90s, Dr. Hamlin continues to work at the hospital. Dr. Catherine Hamlin is a most fitting recipient of the President's Award through her promotion of the well-being of her patients and her lifelong contribution to the resolution of major social and community health issues in the community which she serves. Dr. Hamlin grew up in the Sydney suburb of Ryde along with 5 siblings and her parents. She graduated in 1946 from the University of Sydney Medical School, became a resident in obstetrics at Crown Street Women's Hospital. Catherine married Dr. Reginald Hamlin in 1950, and in 1959 they accepted a contract with the Ethiopian government to set up a midwifery school in Addis Ababa. While there, the Hamlins were confronted with the plight of obstetric fistula sufferers, a condition rarely found in the developed world. Obstetric fistulas have both physical and social implications for women in Ethiopia. The women leak constantly and are often shunned from their villages. Their conditions are considered a curse or punishment. When the midwifery school shut down, having trained only 10 midwives, the Hamlins built the Addis Ababa Fistula Hospital to serve the needs of local women. When the hospital first opened, the Hamlins funded most of the treatments through their own salaries, with Catherine sewing the clothes and the sheets used in the hospital. Economic challenges were not only the ones faced by the Hamlins, who continued their work despite years of political and civil unrest, drought and famine in Ethiopia. Together, the Hamlins became pioneers in the modern technique of obstetric fistula surgery, treating more than 40,000 women and having a 92% success rate. Wedge Hamlin died in 1993. Catherine, with the love and support of those she worked with, chose to stay on and continue to serve the local women. Today, Addis Ababa Fistula Hospital and its 5 regional hospitals treat obstetric fistula patients free of charge, largely from donations. For a population of almost 100 million, Ethiopia has fewer than 200 obstetricians and gynaecologists, and fewer than 5,000 trained midwives. In Ethiopia alone, approximately 9,000 women die in obstructed labour each year, with another 9,000 surviving with a fistula. In 2006, the Hamlin College of Midwives was built to focus on prevention, training locals in a 4-year degree and deploying them back to communities to work with mothers and families in providing clean and safe births. In 2010, the first 11 graduates were employed in local health centres and over 70 midwives are currently in training. In 1983, Catherine Hamlin has received a Member of the Order of Australia for her services to gynaecology in developing countries. She was promoted to the grade of Companion of the Order of Australia in 1995. She was twice nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. In 2001, she was awarded the Centenary Medal for long and outstanding service to international development in Africa, and has even been declared one of Australia's national living treasures. Dr. Hamlin's autobiography is entitled The Hospital by the River, A Story of Hope. As AMA President, it is an honour to present this award to Catherine Hamlin. Dr. Hamlin cannot be with us to receive this award because of her work. It will be accepted on her behalf by Isabel Menton, the Fundraising and Volunteers Manager at Hamlin Fistula Hospital, Ethiopia, Australia. Isabel will respond on behalf of Dr. Hamlin and will play a short video for you about her work. Thank you.
First of all, I'd just like to say thank you to the AMA for recognising such an incredible lady. I was in Ethiopia with Catherine last November, and she's 91, but she's still incredibly busy. She dashes around the hospital, visiting the patients, doing rounds. She's just been in Switzerland for a UN event for World End Obstetric Fistula Day, so she's definitely not put her feet up yet. Catherine will be so thrilled about receiving this award, not because she wants any personal recognition for herself, but look, she really appreciates any opportunity to shine a light on the women that she's helping and, you know, the suffering that is going on. When Catherine and her husband Reg first arrived in Ethiopia, they were told that the fistula patients would break their hearts, and they did. Childbirth should be a joyful occasion, but it can go wrong. And when it goes wrong for a woman living in rural Ethiopia, she is a long way from help. Many women in Ethiopia are 2 days' walk from the nearest road, let alone the nearest hospital or obstetrician. In fact, there are more Ethiopian doctors in Washington, DC than there are in all of Ethiopia. Catherine has dedicated her life to helping these women. Through horrendous famine and civil war that killed hundreds of thousands of people, she and Reg stayed in Ethiopia working to help these women. In 1974, they opened the Addis Ababa Fistula Hospital, a hospital dedicated to providing holistic care to women with obstetric fistula. Now there are also 5 regional hospitals, a midwifery college, a long-term treatment and reintegration facility, and a few hundred Ethiopian staff. They've got some of the top surgeons in the world and actually train obstetricians from all over the world in fistula surgery. And to date, they've treated more than 43,000 women, which I think is pretty incredible. For almost 60 years, Catherine has been working for the patients, and I'd like to share one of their stories with you. Hannah is from the Afar region in northern Ethiopia. At 19, she became pregnant with her first child. After an agonising 6-day labour, her child was stillborn. Hannah was left with an obstetric fistula and was completely incontinent. Without access to running water, Hannah found it impossible to stay clean. She became isolated from her community and her husband left her. Afraid and alone, Hannah spent 2 years curled up on her side, hoping to get better. Hannah heard of the hospital in Addis Ababa where women just like her were being cured. Unable to walk, she was brought on a stretcher by her brothers. She was suffering from severe depression, nerve damage, and muscle contractures, among other complications. Hannah was given good food, physiotherapy, as well as other medical services, love and support. Her fistula was closed with a single operation. When Hannah was better, she was given a big send-off by other patients and staff. She left the hospital a happy woman, completely dry, in a new dress with bus money to go home. Hannah's treatment only cost $600. $600 was all it cost to give her her life back. Obstetric fistula is a devastating injury, but it is treatable, it is preventable. If we can train enough surgeons and enough midwives, and we can give women access to clean, safe birth, we can eradicate it. So I'd ask you all to consider making a tax-deductible donation to support Catherine's work and help us solve this problem. We're going to leave you with a short video about Catherine's life in Ethiopia, and once again on behalf of Catherine and everyone at Hamlin Fistula Ethiopia, we really appreciate it. Thank you.
To think it's going on when we've got so much in medicine, and we can't save women in labour. You can't help being upset to see a woman, a beautiful woman, dying for nothing. He was the superintendent of a big hospital in Sydney, and I was working there as an intern. We went to a hotel and had a meal together. So that's when I first started to go out with him. And then we got married after about 6 months. We answered an advertisement in the Lancet Medical Journal, which is a very prestigious English medical journal, and it said, Ethiopia wants a doctor, a gynecologist for Addis Ababa, and to train midwives. We wanted to go somewhere where we could do some good for somebody without enough doctors, some country. We saw this one, and we said, well, why don't we apply for this? We were in the army hospital, and we used to get the frozen plasma from the Red Cross in Sydney. We had no blood bank in the country, so we'd get a woman might come in there bleeding to death, and we had nothing to give her. So this plasma was life-saving. We started the hospital in 1974, and when we first opened, we had just simple beds, and just staff doing around, Reg just talking to a patient. I would just hug them and try to say a few words in Amharic to them, and Reg would do a great scene. Oh, he used to tell them what was going to happen when they're cured, that they were going to go to their village and people would be looking out from their homes and saying, who's this beautiful girl coming up the hill? And then find out that it's their daughter coming back, cured. They loved him. I don't know what I love about Ethiopia, but I love the people, and I love the scenery, and I love the simplicity of life here. I'd like to see our hospital turn into a maternity hospital. I won't see it, I'm afraid, but we could eradicate fistulas if we had enough doctors. The government's given us 3 rooms out of every health centre that they set up. And also we've got our fistula centres working hard in the countryside. Our midwives now are doing good work. They're really making a difference. We have to get rid of this fistula.
All right, well, it's been a very moving afternoon. We now turn to the debate of motions. We have motions on notice and debate of urgency motions. We'll start with the urgency motions, but I would like to highlight that I have accepted today a motion on short notice in my capacity as chair and in accordance with the bylaws. And that will be debated following the urgency motions. Okay, so the urgency motions were accepted as being urgent pursuant to Standing Order 4.5, page 23 of your handbooks. The proposer of an urgency motion has 3 minutes to introduce the motion. Each successive speaker has 1 minute, and Ms. Trimmer's got the timer. No amendments can be